Well, good day, folks. It's a pleasure to be here, to be able to speak to you about some of the water issues associated with starting up water systems after they've been stagnant for a period of time. And this is an important factor when it comes to the possibility of some kind of bacteria growing in the water. It's a fact. It will happen, especially if buildings sit stagnant. So my experience has been pretty extensive. I've got 45 years of hospital work, starting out as a kidney dialysis technician and really beginning to understand the import of the water quality in the treatment of patients. And in my day, it used to be that the patients would shiver and shake because of the high doses of endotoxin that were in the dialysis equipment at that time, unbeknownst again to the medical staff. And that was the start of my career and beginning to understand the facts that go into pure water that is used for treating patients. And that's really the crux of what we're concerned about in these kinds of situations, is making sure patient safety is paramount and not associated with water quality. And certainly in my experience, I've worked on more than a few water quality issues, and they're going on today all across the world, and it's all about the patient and the severe immune suppression that goes on in many patient treatments that we have today. So with that introduction, I'd like to begin our presentation of water quality and the questions associated with that.
How important are pH levels for incoming water?
Well, pH is really quite important for the stability of the chlorine disinfectants that is used in water. For example, if you have free available chlorine, the pH should be closer to neutral in order for that free available chlorine to work its best. Likewise, if you combine the chlorine into monochloramine, it needs a higher pH to work better. So in the graphic, I have an example of that, and it really shows the effectiveness of free available chlorine. Now, we could show other charts, but really balancing the water chemical challenge is really important because in order for us to protect ourselves from piping, they add phosphate, which enhances biofilm formation. So it's really important to keep those chlorine levels up because, as you can see, as the pH goes up, the effectiveness of that chlorine product goes down. So it's important to control or to know what the pH is with respect to the disinfectant.
Will building flushing procedures differ between city and well water sources?
The important thing to remember with that question is that the drinking water standard must be met in either situation. You can use groundwater, surface water, or even mix them, which they do in many cities. The water quality standards are really a part of the flushed water used regardless. In the graphic, for example, you can see that the mineral content is quite variable between well water, which is deep in the earth, and the surface waters, which are either a reservoir, lake, or a river. Likewise, the organic content really goes up with exposed types of vegetation. Chlorination works best in many instances with free available chlorine with the well water, simply because there isn't any chlorine there to react to the organic content to create the trihalomethane, which is a carcinogen which the EPA protects us from by setting a standard. Bacterial levels vary, the pH is varied again depending on where it is, and of course the ability to treat must be anticipated in these efforts. So there is a difference, but yet the drinking water standard stays the same.
If my building has cold water only, is flushing still necessary?
If this was close to the Arctic Circle, we would be not dealing with terribly warm groundwater. But if you come to the South Florida, for example, the summer months and the winter months allow that ambient temperature of the water to go up, and that again promotes growth. So water in clinical settings, we need to have some common sense. And one of the things that we found in hospitals are these looped showers. In some instances, especially patients like bone marrow transplant patients who have over 40 days on average in the hospital. They don't feel like taking showers, and they will let that water sit in those lines for weeks, if not a month. And the numbers are astronomical. And there's a good example of that in the bottom part of this slide. You can see that when we sample 16 times, we find enormous numbers. 10 to the fourth, 49,000, 50,000 organisms. And when we flush it for 2 minutes, the number drops 2 orders of magnitude. So it's very effective in getting the numbers down. And a lot of times it's a dose-dependent exposure. Likewise, we have to be a little smart and let those hoses dangle so they drain. There are mechanisms that do drain these shower lines, and those are important to consider, especially in the high-risk areas. This is a situation where there was a construction project across the street from a hospital that had a burn unit, and this is the burn unit's system that they had. And those hoses that you see dangling were heavily infested with bacteria that came from the municipal water system that was right beside where they were building a brand new stadium. And the outages and the connections that were made caused contamination. I collected that water, demonstrated where the bacteria came from, and contaminated these hoses. And certainly things like Stenotrophomonas multifida are unique because they develop resistance. And that's one thing we really don't want. If the microbiology is affected by an antibiotic, great. But if it's not, we have a problem on our hands. And that's why we have to be really careful with water quality and bacteria found there.
Is flushing the hot water tank necessary if it is kept above 140 degrees Fahrenheit?
Bacteria are affected by 140 degrees, and we can actually use that temperature to pasteurize things like ice cream. It takes a while, but in reality, it really keeps the numbers down. And we just have to make sure that that 140 degree water gets to the distal end of whatever hose. So it effectively kills those microbes, and that means flushing. So there's a double whammy going on. Not only are you providing hot water, but you are also flushing away those bacteria. And it's important to have a certain contact time with that temperature in order for it to be effective. Now, you can't turn all your spigots on at once because you're running out of hot water. So it takes some thought, and that's part of the water management team and their evaluation.
Would a qPCR or culture test after a flush validate the efficacy of the flush?
PCR, it's a very rapid way in which we can identify the organisms that are there. Generally speaking, if we are concerned about the water quality, we would take a sample, find out what bacteria are there, and then develop a test for that. The culture test, you see if they grow. A lot of the water bacteria take a fair amount of time to grow. Most water bacteria that are of a classification of gram-negative stain can grow in 20 minutes, double in 20 minutes, whereas other kinds of bacteria like Mycobacterium take a lot longer to be growing up. It takes 24 hours to double. So we really need to think about how we're going to validate the system for that flush. Do you culture it or do you use a PCR? If you're in a hurry, PCR really goes well.
If a healthcare building has secondary disinfection, like copper-silver ionization or monochloramine, would it still be advisable to have pathogen filtration in areas with high-risk patients?
If water sits idle for almost any length of time, with the double time of a gram-negative water bacteria being 20 minutes, you can imagine how high the numbers could get. The problem we run into is the chlorine goes away with time. So we may have those water free floating bacteria, planktonic bacteria, coming off the biofilm source, and that biofilm has a potential for opportunistic bacteria adapting resistance due to the fact that the biomass has so many bacteria that can change. So the filtration would offer an additional protection from times of low water disinfectant or even times of stagnation as they try to start up, let's say, an inactive room that's been empty for some days. So this precaution is really relevant for the immune compromised patients, which we are really seeing more and more of in our hospitals today. This session today has covered pretty much the whole aspect of flushing. How effective is it? And we've described that to you in a manner that I hope you understand, and certainly we can discuss it if you wish by asking additional questions of Nephros, and they would forward them on to me, and I would be available again to answer questions as they come up. But I hope today has been a little helpful in better understanding some of the issues that go into making sure our water quality is safe. I thank you for the opportunity, and good day.